Okay, so as you know from your research, on April 1st, the Israelis struck the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria, killing 7 people, including 2 commanders. This is an act of war because the embassy is considered Iranian territory. And never before has this been done intentionally. Okay? And this follows the assassination of their general Qassem Soleimani in 2020, right? This is when the Americans launched a drone strike against him in Baghdad. And he was really the top, one of the top Iranian generals. And what both of these incidents show us is that the Americans and the Israelis have dominance over Iran, okay? So military dominance. So the first thing is they have technology, right? So technologically, America and Israel are so much superior to Iran. So that there's a jet that went from Israel and went to Damascus to carry out the strike. Now, if you did the research, you would know that the Canadian embassy is right next to the Iranian embassy. And the strike was so precise that it only hit the Iranian embassy and didn't touch anything else, okay? That's a precision strike. That's how powerful the technology that the Americans and the Israelis have, okay? But the other thing that's important is the idea of intelligence. So how did the Israelis know that these commanders would be there at that time, right? That's intelligence. And intelligence comes in 2 forms, right? There's the idea of human, and then signals. Signals is basically, I can listen in on your cell phone. I can track where you go. I know where your car is, right? That's signals, and electronic intelligence. The other is human. So there are spies in the embassy who tell the Israelis that this meeting will happen. Okay? So this is clearly military dominance that Israel and the Americans possess over Iran. And when this strike happened, as you know, the Iranians had to respond. And this was called Operation True Promise. And the idea of True Promise was that there's a strike package, okay, consisting of 300 drones and missiles that hit Israel. Now, what the Israelis say is that 99% of these drones and missiles were intercepted. They caused no damage. And the Israelis says, this shows that our Iron Dome system is amazing. We're amazing. Iran cannot touch us. What the Iranians said is that, no, we designed the attack to be harmless. We intentionally designed the attack so that it would not cause that much damage. Okay? So who's right, the Israelis or the Iranians? I want to make an argument to you today that the Iranians are more believable, more credible. Okay? And the reason why is that the Iranians have to be very strategic in their response to the Americans and the Israelis. And the reason why is the Americans and the Israelis have military dominance over Iran. But just because you have military dominance does not mean you'll win the war, okay? So what I believe is that Iran and Israel are committed to a war. And it's possible that in 2 years' time, there will be a ground invasion of Iran. Okay? But it's going to take time to build up to the ground invasion. But just because the Americans and the Israelis attack Iran does not mean they will win. Okay? And the reason why is that, as you know from your research, in 2002, the Americans actually tried to invade Iran. Okay? They ran a simulation called the 2002 Millennium Challenge. And the idea is, let's pretend that we will invade Iran and let's see what happens. So they divide the military into 2 teams, right? Team USA and Team Iran. Now, if you know anything about the American military, you will know that it is the most dominant, powerful military ever to exist in human history, okay? It is crazy powerful. If the entire world were to get together and say, let's go fight the United States, the world would lose. The United States has the most powerful military in the entire world, okay? And Iran, it's a very poor country. So the United States invaded Iran, and they wanted to see what would happen. And it turned out that, who won? Iran won, okay? And the reason why Iran won is the idea of asymmetrical warfare. All right? And this is a very important idea that you must know if you are to understand this conflict. So what is asymmetrical warfare? All right, let's pretend that Jack and I are enemies. We hate each other and we want to kill each other, okay? Jack has armor and he has a machine gun. I have nothing, okay? So in most battles, Jack's going to kill me, right? But let's pretend that I live in a dark forest. And it's really hard to see in this dark forest, but I've been living there for decades, okay? So I know this dark forest very, very well. So if Jack attacks me in this dark forest, then it's possible for me to win because I can set traps, right? I can play tricks on Jack. And that's the idea of asymmetrical warfare, okay? Even though Jack is superior, because I'm inferior, I'm forced to be much more strategic in how I fight against Jack, okay? And so asymmetrical warfare means that as long as you can define the terms of engagement, as long as you can control how the war is fought, you will win. Okay? So let's look at what this means for Iran and the United States. So the United States has these aircraft carriers, and they cost like $1 billion, okay? They're very expensive, but they're very powerful. Now, in a symmetrical warfare, what would happen is Iran sends its entire navy against this one aircraft carrier of the United States. And then what happens? The United States blows up the entire Iranian navy, okay? That's what would happen. So you don't do that, okay? You do not send your navy against an American aircraft carrier. What you do instead is you send drones, okay, or drone swarms. So what they did in the Millennium Challenge was they had these suicide boats, right, charging these aircraft carriers. And guess what, guys? If there's a lot of them, like 1,000 of them, you can't stop all of them. And if one hits, then your boat sinks. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, this is what we call asymmetrical warfare. Now, what's important to understand is that in asymmetrical warfare, you have to control how much resources you use, okay? So, for example, this aircraft carrier costs like $1 billion. The drone swarms, okay, a drone may be $1,000 for a real one, okay? But then you have fake ones that cost $100. $1,000 are these drones that blow up, right? $100 are drones that don't blow up, right? You have 1,000 of these, and then that's like $10 million. And then you have 10,000 of these, and that's another $10 million, okay? So it'll cost you maybe $20 million to blow up a $1 billion aircraft carrier. Okay, does that make sense? And this is why Iran would win a war, because Iran would employ asymmetrical warfare, drone swarms against the American aircraft carriers. Okay? And the True Promise actually showed us that the Iranians would probably use a strategy. And the reason why is that the total package, the strike package that the Iranians use, cost about $10 to $30 million. But how much money did the Israelis spend to bring down these drones? Do you guys know? How much did it cost the Israelis to defend themselves against this attack? Okay, it was at least $1 billion. Okay, do you understand? All right. So this shows us that in a war, Iran would use asymmetrical warfare, and and even though Israel and the United States have military dominance, they may not be able to win this war. Okay. Okay. So does this make sense so far? Any questions about this? Okay, that's a really good question, okay? And the question really is, okay, listen, the Iranians will use this asymmetrical warfare strategy against the Americans. And so shouldn't the Americans respond with more strategic thinking? And that's a great question. And the answer is the Americans would not do that. Why not? Why is it that asymmetrical warfare is so effective against empires and dominant military powers? What's the problem of empires usually? What is their biggest problem? What is their fatal flaw? Okay, they have too much bureaucracy, but Iran also has bureaucracy. But the empires have a much bigger problem, okay? Now let's go back to the Millennium Challenge. Now, in the first test, in the first battle, Iran won against the United States, right? So what did the United States do? And do what? They did it again. They did another second. They did a second simulation. In the second simulation, what did they do? Exactly. Okay. What the Americans said is, nope, this is cheating, guys. Okay, do you understand? Asymmetrical warfare is cheating. You cannot cheat. And then the Americans won. Does that make sense? Okay? So remember, in the first instance where you are allowed to use asymmetrical warfare, the Iranians won. In the second instance, the Americans said, no, asymmetrical warfare is cheating. So you're not allowed to use asymmetrical warfare. You must fight us directly. And the Americans won. What does this tell us about the American military? Exactly. Thank you. Okay, they are inflexible. Empires are inflexible, and the reason why is the idea of hubris. Right? If you're an empire, you refuse to admit your failings and faults. You become very stubborn. Okay? So it's back to the example of Jack has his machine gun, his armor. Right? He comes in the Stark Force thinking like, I'm invincible, right? And like everyone's like, Jack, don't go into that dark forest. It's stupid. But Jack's like, no, I have a machine gun. I don't care. All right? So that's the situation. That's why asymmetrical warfare is so effective, because it allows you flexibility and creativity, and the empire, the dominant power, refuses to be flexible and creative. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, and so the classic example of this is Vietnam, where the Vietnamese were clearly dominated by the Americans, but the Vietnamese were using extremely creative and flexible tactics against Americans, whereas the Americans insisted on their main military doctrine. Okay, does that make sense? All right, great. Okay, any more questions? That was a great question. Thank you. Any more questions before we move on? Okay, so now I want to talk about, okay, if the Iranians are going to use asymmetrical warfare, what would it look like? And the answer is this. When the Americans invade, okay, the war started. Before the invasion, the Iranians must do 4 things if it is to prevail in the war, okay? And this is what we call the Iran strategy matrix. Okay? The Iran strategy matrix means that from now on, everything they do must fit into the strategy matrix. Okay? It must accomplish the objectives of the strategy matrix. So the first thing it must do is unite the population. Okay? Second thing it must do is build alliances. And the third thing is win global opinion. And the fourth is weaken the enemy. Okay? So, in other words, everything that Iran is going to do from now until the actual invasion will be to accomplish all four goals at once. And it must, if it is to survive a full-scale American invasion. Okay? Does it make sense? All right. So, unite the population. What does this mean? Okay? It means that you win the war depending on how much your population is willing to resist the invasion. And it turns out that even though the Iranians right now are divided, okay, there's a lot of opposition towards the current government in Iran. As some of you know, there have been some protests over the past few years, women protesting for more rights in Iran, okay? So there's a lot of division in that country. But I think that most Iranians would resist an invasion. And the reason why is that the Iranians have a very bad history with Westerners, okay? So the example is the 1953 coup d'etat, okay? So what happened is that in 1909, the British discovered oil in Iran. It was called Persia back then. And so they created a company called the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, which we now know as British Petroleum, okay, BP. And the idea is that this company would be responsible for extracting and selling all the oil. But unfortunately, the deal was that Iran, Persia, would only get 16% of profits. Okay? They only got 16% of profits. So the Iranians are very upset about this. It's their oil, it's their resource, but they're not getting that much money out of it, okay? It's basically stealing. So for decades, the Iranians have been trying to renegotiate the deal. In 1953, the democratically elected government of Iran said to the British, listen, let's do 50-50. Okay, that's fair, 50-50. 50% for us, 50% for you, right? That's a fair deal. And the British, instead of saying yes, went to the Americans, and the British and the Americans together launched a coup d'etat against the democratically elected government of Iran and installed a police state called the Shah. Okay, the Shah, which is like the monarchy, okay? And the Shah, the king of Iran, was so brutal that he created a police state. In 1979, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah, okay? And so the Iranian people do not like the idea of foreign invaders coming in and controlling the resource, okay? Does that make sense? So over time, as Israel and as America continues to be aggressive towards Iran, the population will start to coalesce and fight against the Americans, okay? So that's unite the population. Second is build alliances. Now, Iran has two layers of alliance. The first layer is called the axis of resistance, right? Which I asked you to research. And the axis of resistance includes the Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen. Okay? Now, what's important to understand is that this is not an alliance. What's important to understand is that this is an alliance. Okay? They agree to fight together because they have common interests, which is to remain independent of American influence. Okay? But that does not mean that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis take orders from Iran, okay? They're not controlled by Iran. Iran supports them militarily and financially, but Iran cannot completely control their behavior. Okay, so the example is on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack against Israel, right? Which resulted in this war. And Iran says, we were not involved. And Israel says that can't be true because you control Hamas, all right? So that's the first layer of alliance. But what Iran needs to do, if it is to win the war, is also bring in Russia and China. Okay? Russia wants the United States to fight Iran. Why? Yeah, but true, to distract and weaken the United States, and also to move the attention away from Ukraine, right? Does that make sense? Because Russia is about to win the war in Ukraine, and if there's a war in Iran, then the United States will be forced to divert resources away from Ukraine into Iran, okay? What would Russia bring to the table? Russia will probably not deploy soldiers, okay? But what Russia would do is say to the United States, when you invade Iran, you are not allowed to use tactical nuclear weapons, okay? You understand? Russia would say that, hey, United States, if you use weapons, nuclear weapons against Iran, we will use nuclear weapons against you, okay? So basically, Russia would limit the military options of America in a war, which would be of tremendous benefit and advantage to Iran. Okay? Does that make sense? China needs to help Iran. Why? What does Iran have that China really needs? What does Iran have that China really, really needs? It really needs this. The Chinese economy needs what? Oil, right? So basically, China can afford for the United States to take over both Iraq and Iran because then it can control the energy supply to China. Okay, does that make sense? So China would involve itself over time in order to make sure that it's able to obtain oil from the Middle East. China right now is getting most of its oil from the Middle East. Okay? But it will take time for Russia and China to get themselves involved. For Russia and China to get themselves involved in this conflict, Iran must prove two things. What are these two things? What must Iran show to China and Russia in order to get China and Russia involved in this conflict? If you're China and Russia, you're an investor, right? Why will I invest in you, Iran? Why? Exactly, okay? So the first thing is we will fight. Second thing is we will win, okay? So this will take time for Iran to prove this to Russia and China. And the more that Iran can show it can win, the more that China and Russia will invest in Iran, both financially and militarily and politically. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so this will take time. And the third thing is win global opinion. So how will Iran win global opinion? What's happening right now that's helping Iran win global opinion, basically? What's happening in the world right now that is helping Iran win global opinion? Or why is the world becoming more supportive of Iran? What thing is happening right now that is outraging or angering the world? What's happening right now? What's Israel doing right now that is outraging the world? Yeah, Gaza, okay? So this is really important for Iran. It must maintain the world spotlight on Gaza, okay? Because what's happening in Gaza, it's basically genocide, right? where the Israelis are committed to solving the Palestinian problem once and for all. And that basically means removing the Palestinians from Gaza. They can go to Egypt, they can go to Jordan, it doesn't matter, okay? But the Israelis want them out of Gaza, okay? And so this will go on for many, many years. And as long as the attention is on Gaza, then people will become much more sympathetic towards Iran over time. Okay? If you've been following the news about America, there have been major protests at Yale and at Columbia and other universities about what's happening in Gaza, okay? All right. And the last is weaken the enemy. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that when the United States invades Iran 2 years from now, 6 years from now, who knows? But when it does so, it wants to build a large coalition of forces, okay? Because then it gives itself legitimacy, right? So this coalition will consist of NATO, Middle East countries, right? And Israel, Saudi Arabia, many, many countries. And what Iran needs to do is create conflict and dissent in this coalition. Okay? And the way it does that is by building up internal dissent. Okay? Does that make sense? There are many people, most people in America do not support a war against Iran. And so Iran needs to encourage this internal dissent. Okay? It can also create conflict between NATO and the United States, okay? Because obviously America will want NATO involved in its invasion of Iran, but why would France and Germany want to involve itself, right? Okay, does that make sense? So these are the 4 major goals of Iran, and it must accomplish all 4 goals if it is to survive an invasion, okay? So from now on, everything that Iran does will be to accomplish all 4 goals, okay? And this is part of asymmetrical warfare. Does that make sense? All right. Now let's look at a concrete example. And the concrete example is Operation True Promise. Why did Iran design Operation True Promise the way it did? And the answer is to accomplish all 4 goals, right? The first is unite the population. And the idea here is Iran needed to show its population that Iran can strike back against Israel, okay? So that's the first thing. Build alliances. Striking Israel is showing its allies and to China and Russia that Iran is willing to fight, okay? Win global opinion. Now, what Iran said is, we designed the strike to not cause damage in Israel. And the reason why is it wants to win global opinion, right? If it throws all these missiles and rockets at Israel and it kills a lot of people, then there'll be a lot of people sympathetic towards Israel. So the attack was designed not to cause any casualties. Okay, does that make sense? All right? And if you are an observer, you think that what Iran did was right because it's a sense of fairness and justice, right? What Israel did was wrong. It attacked an embassy of Iran in Damascus. That is against international law. And Iran, to save face, to pursue justice, threw some rockets at Israel. Okay? So most people think that Iran's response showed restraint, and it was a measured response. Okay, does that make sense? Right? And the last thing is weaken the enemy. Why would this weaken the enemy? Well, because after Iran attacked Israel, Israel wanted to show a strong response, okay? The reason why is that Israel has a policy of disproportionality. So Israel is committed to disproportionality. So what does that mean? It means that if you kill one Israeli, they'll come and kill about 100 of you, 1,000 of you, okay? If you throw one rocket at them, they'll throw 1,000 rockets at you. And the idea here is deterrence, right? To make you afraid of Israel so you would not dare to think to attack Israel. Okay? So when Iran attacked Israel for the first time, by the way, this is the first time that Iran has attacked Israel, then Israel was committed to a disproportionate response. Who stopped Israel from a disproportionate response? Who? Yes, why? Why would the United States say, Israel, do not strike back disproportionately? Why would the United States do that? Yeah, okay. So the United States cannot afford right now to fight another war. And also, if the United States were to fight a war, it would have to do so by itself, okay? NATO would not involve itself. The Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan would not involve themselves either, okay? So the United States had to restrain Israel, and so this is creating conflict between Israel and the United States, okay? So that's why, so in other words, from a military dominance perspective, Operation True Promise accomplished nothing, okay, because you blew nothing up. But from an asymmetrical warfare perspective, you accomplish all your 4 major goals. And that's why the Iranians claim success. And you can make the argument that from a strategy perspective, it was a very successful operation. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Any questions about this? Anything you want to clarify or you don't really understand? Does this make sense to you?
I just wonder, if China ever involved in this situation, will this impact our college life in the US?
Okay, so Peter asked a great question, this war, how will it affect us? We're going to the United States for college, we're Chinese students. Okay, and the answer is this, okay? The answer is, in war, there's something called rules of engagement. And so before they have a war, all the major parties agree on what the rules are, okay? So for example, you look at the war in Ukraine. Now, the United States and NATO are openly supplying weapons and financing and intelligence to Ukraine, right? But from the Russian perspective, we allow that, okay? We will not allow NATO to send troops to fight with the Ukrainians, but we will allow NATO and the United States to provide weapons and financing, okay? Does that make sense? This is what we call the rules of engagement, the rules of war, okay? So the same thing would happen if the United States were to invade Iran. Before the actual invasion, there would be an agreement among all major parties, which would include Iran, the United States, Russia, China, Israel, about the rules of war. And so one important rule of war is you're not allowed to use tactical nuclear weapons, okay? Iran, you may have nuclear weapons, you're not allowed to use them. United States, you have nuclear weapons, Israel, you have nuclear weapons, but you are not allowed to use them in this war, okay? That would be the first agreement. Second agreement is that Russia and China are allowed to provide assistance in a very limited basis, okay? So China will probably provide weapons and material. But this will not impact the relationship between China and the United States, okay? And during this war, China will maintain a position of what we call strategic ambiguity. And all this is saying is that China is not going to say that we support Iran. Okay? Russia will not come out and say we support Iran. Never, before this war happens, Russia and China could, if they choose, sign a treaty with Iran saying that if anyone attacks you, we'll come to your aid, right? They will not sign this treaty. because they need to maintain strategic ambiguity. Okay? China and Russia do not want to be dragged into this war. Does that make sense? Okay? So my guess is that China will provide assistance to Iran, but on a very limited basis and on a basis that the United States can accept. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is, listen, I'm just making a prediction that this war will happen. I don't know if it's going to happen, okay? You understand? I'm just your high school teacher. I'm not making the decisions, okay? I'm just teaching you how to think about geopolitics. And third of all, when you actually in the United States, you'll find that there's so much anger at Israel that no one really cares about Chinese students. Do you understand? I mean, like at that point, most Americans will be extremely anti-war. It'll be like the Vietnam War, where you have this massive protests and civil unrest because there were a lot of Americans who were against the war, and quite honestly, it was a pointless war. America accomplished nothing by fighting the war. Okay. Okay. So great question, Peter. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Any more questions? Okay, great question, okay. So we talked about the idea of hubris, right? Empires have hubris. And so Israel is a small nation, about 8-9 million people, right? It's not the American empire. It's not the American empire. The problem is this. The problem is that if you look at the Middle East, the strongest military power in the Middle East is Israel by far, okay? Israel does not actually need American protection. If the entire Middle East got together and attacked Israel, Israel would win because this happened twice before, right? In the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War. So military speaking, Israel is powerful. And quite honestly, if the United States were to retreat from the Middle East, Israel would dominate. Okay? So even though it does not look like an empire, it's basically an empire. You understand? So therefore, it suffers from hubris. Okay? It's not going to be strategic and flexible and creative. It doesn't have to be, because it has military dominance over everyone. But that's a very good question. Okay? Just because Israel is small does not mean it is weak. It's very, very powerful. Okay? Any more questions? Okay. The question is very interesting. So, is America constraining Israel? And you can make the argument both ways, okay? You can make the argument that American presence in Israel is preventing Israel from starting a regional war. Okay? But you can also make the argument that Israel right now is using America to pursue a lot of its geopolitical interests. Okay, so it's a very complicated question. Okay, but I think that I personally think that America is right now constraining Israel. Okay, because Israel needs American support, and that constrains the actions of Israel. But if America were not around, then it's possible that Israel unleashes the full might of its military. And its military is very, very powerful. Okay? All right? But if America were to leave the region, then I think Israel would become the dominant power in the region. But I think the same is true throughout the world. If America left Europe, who would become the dominant power? Germany, right? And if America left East Asia, who would become the dominant power? Japan, okay? Okay, does that make sense? So I would say that the regional powers right now are Germany, Israel, and Japan. And it's American empire that's constraining all three right now. And if America were just like to go back home and isolate itself, then these three nations would rise to the top. Okay? Any more questions?
What will happen to America after it loses the war?
That's a great question, okay? So, first of all, listen, this is all theory and conjecture, right? America has not expressed any intent of invading Iran. And if America does invade Iran, then chances are it will win the war, okay? But an invasion of Iran, if it loses the war, it would basically mean the end of the American empire, okay? And the reason why is, if you look at why empires collapse, it's because of three reasons, okay? The first is the idea of extension, okay? Overextension. It's doing too many things at once, okay? It's fighting this war in Ukraine, it's fighting this war in Iran, it's fighting this war everywhere, basically, okay? The idea of overextension, that's the first reason. Second is the idea of debt. It basically just runs out of money, right? Because it's overextended. And this leads to the idea of civil unrest, okay? So the American empire is heading into a lot of trouble over the next 10 years because all three things are happening at once, right? Overextension, debt, and civil unrest. At the same time, the American empire is extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. So even though America loses the war, there's still no peer competitor to the United States. But all that means is that the world will divide into different regional blocks, okay? Where maybe Germany controls Europe, Japan controls East Asia, Israel controls the Middle East, okay? So more of a parallel world, okay? A multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world where one nation controls everything. Okay? The decline of the American empire is going to take decades, possibly centuries. Okay? But we'll talk about this in future class. Okay? What will happen to America if it loses the war? Okay? Any more questions? Yeah?
I'm a little confused. Will Israel or America attack Iran first? Or they are basically the same thing?
Okay. So that's a good question. Okay. Okay, the ground invasion. What will provoke it? Okay. And that's something that I want to spend a future class on. Okay. But listen, we've done a lot of wars. Okay. And we know that America doesn't really need a reason to fight a war. Do you understand? It can just make up a reason. It doesn't care. So basically, the argument that I want to make is that if Trump wins the presidency, then it's most likely that he will start a war against Iran. Okay, that's what I think. I think it will be Trump who initiates the war, and I think that it will happen maybe 2 years from now.
But is there a possibility that Israel will just fight against America? Like, if they're like under constraint and they're disagreeing with it, maybe?
So this is a very complicated question, okay? Like, what's the relationship between Israel and America? And the reason why it's complicated is that there's something called the Israel lobby. And again, we need to spend an entire class on the idea of the Israel lobby because it makes no sense, okay? It's really hard to understand by itself. So I'll spend an entire class on the Israel lobby, and then you understand why there's an alliance between Israel and America, okay? All right, but thank you, okay? Any more questions? So just to summarize, we will do a class on Jack's question, what will the war look like, and what will it mean for America if it loses the war. We'll also do a class on David's question, which is, what's the relationship between Israel and America? Okay. Any more questions?
Will we be talking about Japan?
We will, yes. We'll also be talking about the rise of Japan and Germany. Okay. All right. Any more questions? Okay, great. I'll see you next week. Okay. Okay. Let's start class. So let's review where we are. We are discussing or exploring why the United States would want to invade Iran. And so far, we have two good reasons. The first good reason is called the Israel lobby. There are in the Israel lobby millions of Christian Zionists who believe that a conflict in the Middle East, especially between Israel and Iran, will bring Jesus back to earth. They want their God, Jesus, to return to earth, and they believe that a war in the Middle East will force him to return. Okay, that's the first reason. Second reason is the idea of empire. America is an empire, and as an empire, it has a lot of privileges. For example, it can just print as much money as it wants, right? US dollars. Right now, America is $34 trillion in debt, and the debt is growing by $1 trillion every 2 months. America can do this as long as it is an empire, as long as people fear America. But as we discussed last class, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, people are now starting to rebel against the empire, and therefore America must demonstrate it still is the military hegemon of the world, and therefore it can do this by invading Iran. Okay? Today we look at the third and final force driving conflict in the Middle East. And it's really the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Most people think that Iran's major enemy in the Middle East is Israel. In fact, Iran's major enemy is Saudi Arabia. These two are bitter rivals. And to understand why, we have to look at their history. Okay? So the year is 1979. And at the start of 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran are very good friends. Okay? So let's look at a map of the Middle East. Iran is here. It's next to Iraq. Saudi Arabia is down here. Then this is Egypt. You have Yemen here, Oman. This is the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the Suez Canal, okay? The Red Sea, basically. And in 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran were very good friends. They had a lot of similarities. They were both monarchies. They were ruled by a king. They were secular. They relied on American power to defend itself. And they were both oil exporters, both very prosperous oil exporters. But then, in 1979, a political earthquake radically changed the landscape of the Middle East. In 1979, there was a bottom-up revolution called the Islamic Revolution. Before 1979, there was a general consensus agreement in the Middle East that religion and politics would be separated. But in 1979, the people in Iran demanded three things. Okay? First, they demanded that they will not be ruled by a king. Okay? That's the first demand. Second is that the U.S. should not interfere in domestic politics. Remember that before the king, the Shah, was supported by the American military. And the third demand is that as a Muslim people, as people who believe in the Islamic religion, the government should be focused on Islamic law. Okay? So, in a referendum, 98% of the people of Iran voted to install an Islamic republic to replace their monarchy. And this was completely unexpected. And this caused an earthquake throughout the Middle East. In November of 1979, 600 religious extremists tried to besiege Mecca, okay? Mecca is the holiest city in the Islamic religion because it's the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. 600 extremists tried to take the city over and demand three things, okay? That the Saudi Arabian monarchy should abdicate. The United States should remove itself from the internal affairs of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia should be governed by Islamic law. Now, this revolt was crushed by the military, but from that day on, Iran and Saudi Arabia became bitter enemies because they were both trying to install their vision of Islam on the Middle East. Okay? So this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia took three forms. Okay? The first form is religious. So even though they're both Muslim countries, Islamic countries, they have different versions of the religion. Okay? So Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and Iran is Shiite. Now, you may ask what the difference between these two different branches of the religion are. And the answer is no one actually knows. It's a very complicated issue. The major difference is this. In 610, the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, in the city of Medina, he had a vision to found a new religion called Islam. Okay? And he spread this religion throughout the Middle East, throughout the Arab world, forever transforming the Middle East. When he died, there's a problem of succession. Who would succeed the Prophet as the leader of the religion? The Shia people believe that only people of Muhammad's bloodline can be the leaders of the religion. The Sunni disagreed and said that anyone who proved himself competent and faithful to religion could be the leader. And so for hundreds of years, these two groups, the Sunni and the Shia, fought a war over the succession. And this led to a bitter rivalry that's lasted to this day, okay? Now, the majority of people in the world, about 80%, are Sunni, okay? The majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni. 10% are Shia, okay? So why this is important is that Saudi Arabia is a Sunni country, and Iran is a Shia country. And at the time of the revolution, Iran dedicated itself, committed itself to spreading the Shia revolution throughout the world, okay? Now, Saudi Arabia considers itself the leader of the Islamic world because it is home to both Mecca and Medina, which are the two holiest cities in the entire Islamic religion. As you may know, there's a requirement that as a Muslim, you must take a Hajj, a pilgrimage, to Mecca and Medina once in your lifetime. Okay? And because Saudi Arabia controls Mecca and Medina, that's really the source of Saudi Arabia's authority over the Islamic world. Iran argues that because Saudi Arabia is ruled by a king, that's anti-Muslim. And because the United States is defended by the US military, that's also anti-Muslim. Saudi Arabia is a heresy, okay? So Iran is dedicated itself to subverting Saudi Arabia's authority. Okay, so does this all make sense so far? Okay. Now, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and it practices the most extreme form of Sunni religion called Wahhabism. Okay, Wahhabism. In 1744, the Wahhabis, okay, which again are the most extreme Islamic group, made an alliance with the Al Saud family of Saudi Arabia. And the agreement was this, that the Wahhabism would become the national religion of Saudi Arabia, and the Wahhabis would swear allegiance to the Al Saud family. Okay? But in the 1930s, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia. In fact, Saudi Arabia proved to have the most valuable oil resources in all the world, okay? And at that time, as the world was modernizing, oil was becoming more and more important. And so that made Saudi Arabia extremely wealthy. And as it became more and more wealthy, it tried to become more Western, more secular, more progressive, more modern, which brought it into conflict with the Wahhabis, okay? Now, Wahhabism accounts for 20 to 40% of all the people in Saudi Arabia. So it is a very significant group. More important, Wahhabi people tend to be extremely fanatical. So for example, in 1979, the people who laid siege to Mecca were Wahhabis. And Wahhabis were also responsible for terrorist attacks against tourists, against foreigners in Saudi Arabia. Okay? So Saudi Arabia has always had this problem with the Wahhabis. And a way that Saudi Arabia has tried to resolve the conflict is to export the religion of Wahhabism throughout the world. So for example, Osama bin Laden was a Saudi citizen responsible for spreading Wahhabism in Afghanistan. And that's what started Al-Qaeda. Okay? So Saudi Arabia is trying to export Wahhabism. Iran is trying to export the Shia religion. And so that they come into conflict with each other, okay? So the first source of tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia is over religion. Second is economical. And what that means is that both countries are oil exporters. In fact, Saudi Arabia is completely reliant on oil for its economy. 40% of Saudi Arabia's economy, GDP, is based on oil exports. Saudi Arabia is #1 oil exporter in the world, okay? 75% of government revenues comes from its oil exports. In other words, Saudi Arabia does not actually collect taxes from its citizens. It just sells oil. Okay? Iran also sells oil. It's the #4 oil exporter in the world, but it's less reliant on oil because it has a diversified economy, meaning that it has very strong human capital. It has a very well-educated population that does all sorts of different activities, okay? Science, art, education. So Saudi Arabia, for the longest time, has been trying to control the price of oil in order to maximize profits. For example, it wants to cut back production in order to increase the price of oil, which will increase profits. But Iran often doesn't cooperate because Iran is trying to sell as much oil as possible in order to boost its economy. Okay? So there's economic conflict between these two countries. And the third and final conflict is geopolitical. Okay? And geopolitical means that both countries are trying to exert as much influence as possible over the Middle East. Now, Iran is trying to exert influence over the Middle East because after the revolution in 1979, many countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United States, encouraged Iraq to invade Iran. And this invasion, called the Iraq-Iran War, lasted 8 years, and it cost the lives of millions of Iranians. And from then on, Iran has adopted a policy of aggressive intervention in the Middle East in order to distract the United States and Israel. Okay? So, for example, in Israel, there are two groups opposing Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah. And they're both financed and supported politically by Iran. And the point of doing this is to distract Israel. Okay? Now, Saudi Arabia is trying to exert influence over the Middle East because as the number one oil exporter, it needs to control shipping lanes. Okay? It needs to control this area and this area, the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal. And 40% of all the world's oil passes through these two straits, and they go mainly to East Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan mainly. Okay? So, because of these geopolitical tensions, Iran and Saudi Arabia have fought three proxy wars. Okay? They fought 3 shadow wars. The first is in Iraq. Now in Iraq, as you know, in 2003, America invaded Iraq and destroyed the country. And after they destroyed the country, there's a power vacuum. And so basically, Iran came in and tried to take over the country. And it could do so because 2/3 of the population were Shiite. And therefore, they had affinity with Iran. And 1/3 were Sunni. So what happened was that to counter the Iranian influence in Iraq, Saudi Arabia started to finance the 1/3 of the Sunnis against the Shia. So there was a very violent civil war fought in Iraq after the invasion. Okay? Many people also believe that Saudi Arabia is responsible for the financing of the Islamic State, okay? Or ISIS. Because ISIS really hates the Shia religion. Okay? But over time, because Iran has been so much more effective in projecting its power than Saudi Arabia, basically Iran now controls much of Iraq, okay? So in this first war, Iran defeated Saudi Arabia. Then they fought another war in Syria. Syria's leader, Assad, faced a rebellion. And Saudi Arabia, America, Israel support the rebels against Assad. And Iran came in to support Assad as well as Russia. And over time, Assad was able to crush the rebellion, okay? So in the second proxy war, Iran won as well. Now, there's another proxy war in Yemen, okay? And it started in 2016. So the wars in Iraq and Syria, they were important to Saudi Arabia, but they didn't really threaten Saudi Arabia. But this war in Yemen did threaten Saudi Arabia, okay? So for the longest time, Saudi Arabia supported the Yemen political leadership. And then there was a rebellion by the Houthis, okay? The Houthis. And the Houthis were Shia villagers who lived in the mountains. And they were trying to overthrow the government. And Saudi Arabia was afraid that the Houthis would become friends with Iran. So Saudi Arabia launched a massive invasion of Yemen. It was 150,000 Saudi Arabian troops. They had warplanes. They were backed by the most advanced American weapons and technology, okay? They also had a coalition of about 30 nations, including Egypt and the UAE. Saudi Arabia named this operation Decisive Storm, right? Which sounds like Desert Storm. And the strategy they use is what we call shock and awe. And shock and awe is basically, we have so many bombs, we have so many airplanes, we have so many soldiers that we can, in about a week's time, destroy you, okay? So go in, go fast, be decisive, destroy your enemy. Unfortunately, for Saudi Arabia, this did not work. And the reason why is, first of all, the Houthis were in the mountains. And so your bombs didn't really stop them. In fact, all your bombs did was make them really angry. Because with your bombs, you were killing civilians. Okay? So you're basically uniting the entire population against you. That's the first problem. Second problem is that the Houthis are in the mountains, but Saudi Arabia has oil fields. And guess what, guys? It's really, really easy to blow up oil fields. Okay? So that's what the Houthis are doing. They were sending like these cheap drones. They might cost $1,000, $10,000. And they would blow up oil fields and ports. Okay? Saudi Arabia has another problem, okay? Saudi Arabia has no fresh water. It's in the desert. It is a desert. No water, guys. No rivers. So it relies entirely on desalination plants. Okay? And this is extremely impressive technology, right? It takes salt water, seawater, and turns it into fresh water. It's very impressive. But it's on the coast. And guess what, guys? The coast, so Iran can blow up these plants, and the Houthis can blow up these plants as well. Okay? So Saudi Arabia basically lost this war because the Houthis could inflict massive economic damage on Saudi Arabia. So from this war, Saudi Arabia learned three things, okay? The first thing it learned is that if it wants to defeat their enemies, the Houthis, the Syrians, and the Iraqis, they also need to be able to defeat Iran. Okay? That's the first thing they learned. Second thing they learned is that their economy is extremely vulnerable to attack. At any point, Iran, with its missiles and drones, could destroy the entire Saudi Arabian economy, okay? It can easily blow up all the oil fields and the desalination plants. So the third thing that Saudi Arabia learned from all this is we really need America to fight Iran for us. In the long term, that's the only way we're going to survive as a nation. Okay? We need to defeat Iran. And we can't do it by ourselves. We need America to do it for us. Okay? Unfortunately for Saudi Arabia, in 2001, 9/11 happened, right? 15 of the 19 hijackers were citizens of Saudi Arabia, which meant that America was very unhappy with Saudi Arabia. Okay? Americans didn't like Saudi Arabia. Americans also knew that there were a lot of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. The other thing that happened is in 2003, America invaded Iraq. Saudi Arabia tried to exert as much influence as possible in Washington, D.C. to stop the war. Because they knew that if America invaded Iraq, it would make Iran more powerful. Now, as you know, Saudi Arabia could not stop the war. Okay? In 2008, Barack Obama came into office. And Barack Obama's understanding of the world was that, okay, the Middle East is a complete mess. And it's hopeless. I don't really want to deal with the Middle East. Plus, China is rising. The main threat to American power in the future will be East Asia. So he proposed something called the Asia Pivot, which is to transfer American military resources from the Middle East to East Asia to counter the threat of China. But to do that, you needed to reduce tensions in the Middle East. And so in 2015, he made a deal with Iran called the Iran nuclear deal. And the deal was basically, Obama said to Iran, listen, I know you're trying to develop nuclear weapons. Okay? So what we're going to do is, if you promise to not develop nuclear weapons, we will lift economic sanctions on you so that you can prosper. And Iran said yes, okay? And this really scared Saudi Arabia. Because if America leaves the Middle East and brokers a peace with Iran, then Saudi Arabia would be extremely vulnerable, okay? So Saudi Arabia became very, very desperate. Its very existence was threatened. Also, the economic outlook for Saudi Arabia was not that great. Remember, the entire economy depended on oil. But guess what, guys? Oil is a finite resource. Eventually, you're going to run out of oil. Okay? Now, if you're optimistic, you'll be like, well, Saudi Arabia would run out of oil in about 70 years' time or 80 years' time, okay? But there are also some people who believe that Saudi Arabia will run out of oil in about 10 years' time. And if Saudi Arabia has no oil, then its entire economy collapses. Okay? Then you also have a problem with global warming, right? Climate change. You also have a problem with the entire global economy is slowing down, therefore the demand for oil is decreasing. So the economic outlook for Saudi Arabia, it's extremely grim. Okay? And that's why in 2017, Saudi Arabia appointed a new leader called Mohammed bin Salman, okay, the crown prince, whoever calls MBS. And MBS promised to be a new leader. He was young, he was progressive, he wanted women to drive, he wanted young people to go to the movie theater, okay? And he proposed a new vision for Saudi Arabia called Vision 2030. Okay? But MBS's most important achievement is that he became friends with the new president, Donald Trump. Okay? So in 2016, Donald Trump became president of the United States. And MBS decided that this is an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to reset relations with America. Okay? So Trump, his first trip outside the United States was to Saudi Arabia. That was the first achievement. Second achievement is that MBS became best friends with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Okay? And Jared Kushner was Trump's Middle East advisor. And his job was to bring peace to the Middle East, mainly between Israel and the Arab countries. And to that extent, Kushner did a great job because MBS helped him, okay? So his major achievement is something called the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords is just to establish peace between Israel and the Arab countries so that they can unite against Iran together. So MBS was looking very good. But then in 2018, he did something that scared the world. Okay? MBS was a visionary. He had a plan for where to take Saudi Arabia. He wanted to modernize Saudi Arabia. But he was also young. He was a tyrant. He did not like people who criticized him. Okay? So there's a journalist named Jamal Khashoggi who worked for the Washington Post and who was a permanent resident of the United States. He was a Saudi national. And MBS had him killed. And this caused an international uproar, okay? The CIA, the US government, conducted an investigation, and they determined that it was MBS who ordered the assassination. Trump protected MBS, okay? And then the most important thing that Trump did was in January 2020, Trump ordered the assassination of a man named Qasem Soleimani, who is considered to be the second most powerful man in Iran after the Ayatollah, okay, the supreme religious leader of the country. It is Qasem Soleimani who was responsible for Iran's policies in the Iraq War, the Syria War, and in the Yemen War, okay? So from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, Qasem Soleimani is public enemy number one. He is the greatest threat to Saudi Arabia. Now, before, okay, America had many opportunities to assassinate Qasem Soleimani. George W. Bush had the opportunity, Barack Obama had the opportunity, and both believed that doing so would cause basically World War III, okay? Because if you kill the number 2 leader of Iran, Iran would have no choice but to go to war with you. And that's why they both refrained from killing Qasem Soleimani. In fact, when Trump made the decision to assassinate Soleimani, the entire military was stunned. Okay? They couldn't believe this was happening. So how does this happen? Okay. So for some time, there was some conflict between U.S. soldiers and Shia militiamen in Iraq. And the Pentagon felt it had to act, okay? So in these situations, they had to go to the president and present options to the president of how best to respond. And usually, the Pentagon will design the choices so that the president does what the Pentagon thinks is best, okay? So an example is that if I'm the military and I go to Trump, I give you 3 choices, okay? The first choice is A, 1, let's do nothing, okay? 2 is what you should do. And 3 is let's blow up the world. Okay? So when I present these 3 options to you, you as a president, being wise and strategic, will obviously always pick option 2, right? What you should do, what the military suggests you should do, okay? Unfortunately, in this instance, Trump chose option 3. Let's blow up the world, guys. And so they assassinated Qasem Soleimani, okay? So, in other words, it is very likely that if Trump stayed a second term, the United States would have gone to war with Iran, given how things were progressing. Okay? MBS was so happy about all of this that he once bragged privately to a friend that, oh, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, the man responsible for all Middle East policies, well, he's in my pocket, meaning I own him. Okay? And the evidence that suggests this is that after Trump left office, after Jared Kushner left office, Jared Kushner set up a private equity fund. And MBS and the Saudi government invested $2 billion into the fund. Okay? Does that make sense? So, we don't know how, we don't know this for sure, but it seems like Trump is doing exactly what the Saudis want, which is to inflame tensions with Iran. Okay? And this suggests that if in November Trump wins a second term, it is very possible that Trump will declare war on Iran. Or at the very least, continue to escalate tensions with Iran, okay, which will very likely lead to World War III. So in that respect, the election in November, whether or not Trump comes back into office, is one of the most consequential elections. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Okay, any questions? Anything you want me to clarify before we end class? Okay, so what we will do next class is figure out if Trump will win in November. And I will make the argument to you that it is almost very certain, very likely, that he will win in November. Okay? So we will examine why next class. Okay, let's start class. We're continuing the United States-Iran war. As I've said in the previous class, the United States will invade Iran. We don't know when. It might be 2 years from now. It might be 6 years from now. Okay? But eventually it will happen. And in today's class, I want to go over some of the reasons why the United States will invade Iran. And I believe that there'll be 3 major reasons, okay? The first major reason is the United States must defend its empire. Second major reason is that the United States will be pressured by its allies, mainly Saudi Arabia and Israel, into invading Iran. And the third reason is the Israel lobby. Okay, so in today's class, I want to explain to you what the Israel lobby is. But first, I need you to understand what Christianity is. Okay, so remember that Christianity, it's a religion about a man, Jesus, who we know very little about. Okay, we think that he was born in 4 BCE, and then he died in 31 BC, CE, Common Era. We know that he is from a place called Galilee. We know that the Romans crucified him. And that's about it, okay? What his believers say is that he is God come to earth, and he was preaching a gospel or a message that God is returning. The kingdom of heaven is coming. And after he was crucified, he was resurrected, and then he went to heaven. And what's really important is that Jesus will eventually return. Okay? And this is called the second coming. Okay? This is the second coming of Jesus, and when he comes, he will bring heaven onto earth. And we will all live forever in peace. Okay, so that's the story of Jesus. Then the question then is, why this religion become so popular? So popular, in fact, that today about 2 billion people believe in it. Okay, it's the most popular, most powerful religion in the world. And at first, the appeal of Christianity is that it was a revolutionary religion that promised a better world to the world's oppressed. Okay? So if you look at the early people who followed Christianity, it was slaves, peasants, women, okay? People who were marginalized in society. And the idea of Jesus is that a better world is coming where everyone will be equal. Okay? The meek shall inherit the earth. So if you think about it, Christianity is appealing because what it is, it's a free lottery ticket. Okay, does that make sense? It's a lottery ticket. It costs you nothing, and hey, if it's right, then you go to heaven. Okay? So at first, Christianity was an extremely revolutionary religion. And its basic characteristics in the beginning were it was revolutionary, it was egalitarian, and it was anti-authority. And so these individuals who before were outcast from society, okay, like criminals, Jesus promised hope, salvation, and redemption, okay? So before, if you were a criminal, there was really no way for you to redeem yourself in society. And Jesus is the promise of your salvation and redemption, okay? And that's why it was so appealing to a lot of people. It became so popular that it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now there's a problem, okay? Because remember, Christianity is a revolutionary, egalitarian, and anti-authority religion. And now it's become an empire. So they had to develop new theories to reinvent Christianity as an establishment religion. Okay? And as we discussed last semester, the person who did this was Augustine. Okay, Augustine. Remember that last semester we read City of God and Confessions. And City of God and Confessions, it's really to adapt Christianity as an establishment religion, to reduce its revolutionary nature. Okay, so is this all making sense to you? And one problem that Augustine had was the idea of a second coming, okay? That the world will end. He had a major problem with this idea for many reasons, okay? But the first reason is that, if the world's going to end, why do we have to do anything? Why can't we just drink and party and play video games every day, right? What's the point of working? That's the first problem, right? The second problem is, well, why is Jesus coming back? It's because the world sucks, right? Well, who's in charge of the world? The Catholic Church is in charge of the world. You understand? So Jesus is coming back to destroy the authority of the Catholic Church. That's not good. All right? So for many reasons, Augustine basically said, okay, second coming, don't worry about it. Okay? Jesus will come back whenever he wants to come back. But before he comes back, we, the Catholic Church, will take care of everyone, okay? All right, so why is this important? This is important because from Augustine onwards, we've had divergent understanding of what the second coming means, okay? For people who believe in the second coming, the term we use is premillennialism. Premillennials, okay? Because the second coming promised 1,000 years of peace. Okay, premillennialism is this, okay? Pre means before, right? So when Jesus comes back, he will give us 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. Okay, do you understand? Before he comes back, okay? When he comes back, he will give us 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. And what Augustine said is, no. That 1,000 years is just a metaphor. It's not actually going to happen. In fact, it's already happened because the Catholic Church is giving us this 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. Okay? So he's called a millennialist, which means no, okay? That 1,000 years is just a metaphor. It's not going to really happen, okay? So that's a second big idea. Now, as we know, because all power became concentrated in the Catholic Church, there's a rebellion against the Catholic Church called the Reformation. Okay? The Reformation. And the idea of the Reformation is God did not mean for his authority to be established in the church, to be held by priests. God is meant to speak to all of us through the Bible. Okay, so what the major difference between the Catholic religion and the Protestant religion is Catholics are not allowed to read the Bible. They don't read the Bible. Whereas Protestants must read the Bible. They must seek meaning and guidance from their interpretation of the Bible. Okay? And because of the Reformation, you now have thousands, tens of thousands of different religions spawning up, okay? Does that make sense? All right? So you have different religions and you have different descent. So let's look at England, okay? England. So England, there's a king, and before the Catholic Church was supposed to have authority over the king. And of course, the king did not like that, so he supported the Reformation, and he changed the Catholic Church into something called the Anglican Church, okay? Or the Church of England, which he would have authority over. But once the Reformation started, again, you are now allowed to read the Bible. And because of that, you have thousands of new religions coming up in England, okay? And they believe different things, but one thing that they all believed in is the Bible is the supreme authority. Okay? The Bible is the supreme authority, not the king. Right? So this started a major conflict between these groups and the king. And these people are called dissenters. And eventually this led to something called the English Civil War, where the dissenters, the Puritans, killed the king. Okay? But then the king was reestablished. And so this led to decades and decades of fighting in England. So one way that the king tried to resolve this conflict is by sending all these dissenters to America. Okay? To America. And the idea is this. These dissenters believe that the Bible is a supreme authority. The Bible asks us to do certain things, okay? Because it's written in the Bible. For example, you're not allowed to drink. You're not allowed to dance. You're not allowed to have any fun. You must focus on your own spiritual improvement. Okay? You're not allowed to have slaves. And so, because they believe these things, they were constantly in conflict with the establishment, okay? With people in power. And so the king was like, guys, if you really believe in these things, go to America. Why? Because there's nobody in America. So you can build your own kingdom of heaven. Do you understand? Okay? So this is the origin of the United States. The United States was founded as a Christian nation, which put the Bible as the supreme authority. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys probably don't know this about the United States. You think the United States, it's a non-religious, secular, multicultural nation that believes in science, right? That's what it looks like from the outside. But inside its soul, its history, it is a Christian nation dedicated to achieving the kingdom of God on earth. Okay? And using the Bible as the supreme authority and guide to achieve this kingdom on earth. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So, these people in America and these dissenters, okay, one question that they always ask themselves is, why isn't Jesus back yet? Okay, the second coming. Why isn't the second coming back yet? And different people have different explanations. Okay, and so from this group come two more groups, okay? You have some people who are called the post-millennials. Okay? And post-millennials believe that Jesus will come back after we established 1,000 years of the Christian church in the world. Okay, does that make sense? So we have to prove that we are worthy of God. God's not going to come back and establish this for us. We have to do it ourselves. Okay? So these are what people call post, which is say that Jesus will come after the 1,000 years. But then you have another group called dispensationalists. I don't even know how to spell this word, actually. Okay, anyway, dispensation is historic, okay? All right, so now the premillennialists are split into two other groups. So the historic premillennialists are people who believe what the early Christians believed, which is that Jesus is going to come back. Don't worry when he's coming back. Just be a good person, and he'll come back eventually, okay? It's not up to us to ask when he's coming back. He's God, okay? He has a plan. He knows what he's doing. Just be patient, guys, okay? That's the historic premillennials. And then you have another group called the dispensationalists premillennials, okay? And what they believe is something different. They believe that, in the Bible, if you read the Bible very, very closely, it tells you how and why Jesus will return. Okay? What the Bible says is that there must be a nation called Israel, okay? And Israel is a nation of Jews. And then Israel has something called the temple, because that's where God resides, okay? It must have the temple. And then what will happen, according to the Bible, is that the Antichrist, okay, or Satan, lives. Okay? And then there will be an Antichrist, okay, Satan, who will be the great deceiver. He'll pretend to be God. He'll pretend to be Messiah, but he's really Satan, okay? And then he will launch a war when all the nations of the world will try to attack Israel. And at this point, Jesus will come back, and he will destroy the Antichrist. He will save Israel, and he will usher in 1,000 years of peace. Before, and then 1,000 years later, you'll have the last judgment, where God will judge us to be either worthy or not worthy. If we are worthy, we'll live on forever. If we're not worthy, then we'll burn in hell forever, okay? Okay. So there are different variations of this prophecy, well, that's what they believe, okay? So in other words, the historic premillennialists, what they believe about the coming of Jesus is it's a promise, okay? Jesus promises to return. He's God. He will keep his promise. He's probably very busy right now with other things, so don't worry about it, guys, okay? Let's just be patient and trust in Jesus. Okay? That's what they believe. But the dispensationalists, premillennialists, believe that the prophecy, it's a plan. Okay? It's something that we must achieve to bring Jesus back. And if we do what the Bible tells us to do, which is to say, to have Israel as a nation run by the Jews, to have the temple, and then to face the Antichrist, then Jesus will return. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, so these are the four different views of the end times. Okay? You have the historic premillennialists who believe that Jesus has promised to return. Let's just wait, guys. Don't worry about it. You have the dispensationalists, premillennialists, who believe that we have to work hard to bring Jesus back, okay? And then you have the amillennialists who are like, no, the 1,000 years, it's just a metaphor. It's not going to happen. Don't worry about it, guys, okay? And then you have the post-millennials who believe that it's up to us to establish a good world. Jesus is not going to do it for us. If we do this, then Jesus will return. Okay? And so, but remember, guys, okay, this is a very simple version of the 4 different beliefs. Even within each belief, there are variations, okay? Because again, there are 2 billion people who believe in Christianity, and they all believe something different, okay? Does that make sense? All right, are we clear about the 4 different ideas? Any questions? Okay, so, okay, so you don't actually have to remember this, okay? But all I'm trying to show you is that even within Christianity, there's debate, okay? But there's a concern, an obsession as to when Jesus will return and how he will return. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So, this is important. Now, most Christians don't believe in dispensationalist premillennialism, okay? In fact, most Christians believe that dispensationalist premillennialism is actually pretty evil. Why? Why would it be evil? We cannot believe in dispensationalist premillennialism because it's evil. Why? As a Christian, why would you think this is evil? What's a problem with believing that there's a plan in the Bible? Why would that be anti-Christian? Okay, so this is hard, okay? But the idea is that with this plan, you're trying to manipulate God. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, you're trying to force God to return, and you shouldn't do that. If you believe in God, then you will trust God. And you will try your best to be a good person, which is what the Bible asks you to do. And when God returns, it's none of your business, okay? It's not our concern. So the dispensationalist premillennialists are an extremely controversial minority within Christianity, okay? Most Christians don't actually believe this. And they find that a lot of these beliefs to be evil, and maybe even blasphemous. Okay, you're insulting God with this sort of thinking. Okay, the problem is that of all these groups, the dispensationalist premillennialists, are the most organized, and they're the most fanatical. They really believe that this is true, okay? And we know that throughout history, those who achieve their objectives are people who tend to be the most united and who are the most fanatical in achieving their objective, okay? That's the first point. Second point is that this sort of belief thrives in a time of massive uncertainty and inequality, like the time that we are living in today, okay? Where inequality is growing, where there's more instability and uncertainty. So in other words, there are more and more people who believe in dispensationalist premillennialism. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. All right. So why this is important is that dispensationalist premillennialists, as Christians, have done a lot to cause conflict in the Middle East. Okay? So they're the ones who are actively encouraging conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They're the ones who want Israel and Iran to go to war. Why? Why are they actively encouraging conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis? Why are they encouraging a war between Iran and Israel? Why would they want a war between Iran and Israel?
They want Israel back.
Well, no. Well, Israel is already back. Why? Because it's part of the prophecy. Do you understand? It's part of the prophecy. The prophecy is that Israel must first be reconstituted as a nation. Okay, this happened in 1948. And then Israel must go to war with other nations. Okay, does that make sense? So these Christians are actually promoting war between Israel and its neighbors. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Okay. So now the other thing is that after the Reformation, okay, they developed a new theology called Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism, okay? What is Christian Zionism? Christian Zionism is the belief that as a Christian, you must support Jews in the return to Israel. Okay? So, because remember that Israel as a nation was only founded in 1948. And then basically, in about 70 BCE, the Romans burned down the temple, okay? So for about almost 2,000 years, really, the Jewish people have not lived in, the Jews were not in control of Israel, okay, for about 2,000 years. And there are Christians who believe that it is our responsibility, it is our duty to help Jews take control over Israel. Okay? And they believe this for many different reasons. So Christian Zionists, some may believe that that's what the Bible says. God promised Israel to the Jews. Okay? So Christian Zionism intersects with dispensationalist premillennialism. Okay? There are Christian Zionists who believe that, okay, for Jesus' return, we need Israel back, and we need Israel to be in conflict with the Middle East, okay? So in other words,
Is there a specific country you want them to have conflict with?
the Middle East, okay?
There's neighbor countries.
Yeah, all of them, okay? So, so Christian Zionism, I mean, you can make the argument that it's a pretty evil idea. Why? Because they're using the Jewish people as a tool, as a mechanism in order to achieve what they believe, which is the return of Jesus. Okay, does that make sense? Because Christianity believes that if Jesus returns, then all Jews, then Judaism as a religion will cease to exist. 2/3 of all Jews will die in the battle, and the rest, a third, will immediately convert to Christianity. Okay? So you can make the argument that Christian Zionism, it's a pretty cynical and a pretty evil idea. Okay? And then from Christian Zionism, we have the idea of Zionism. Okay? And Zionism is the belief among certain Jews that two things, okay? One is that the Jews are the chosen people of God and that Israel is the promised land. And therefore, Jews must return to Israel. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? But what's important is before Christian Zionism came along, Zionism was not, Jews didn't really think this, okay? So it was the Christians who supported this idea of Zionism. And even when this idea came about, which was about 200 years ago, it was an extremely unpopular religion, a very extremely unpopular idea. And the reason why is Jews didn't think they were a race of people. They felt they were a religion. Okay? They felt that, okay, I'm in Iraq. Well, guess what? I'm an Iraqi like everyone else. I may have a different belief, but I'm still Iraqi, okay? They didn't put their religion above their nationality or their race, okay? Do you understand? And Zionism is like, no, being a Jewish person is a race, and therefore you must return to Israel, okay? The problem with all this is that in Israel, Palestine, it was mainly Arab people, okay? So there were very few Jewish people. And in fact, Zionism couldn't convince anyone to come to Palestine, okay? But then, of course, the Holocaust happened. And after the Holocaust, many Jews started to go to Israel. And in 1948, they established the state of Israel, okay? And the Christian Zionists and the dispensationalists, premillennialists, were very happy with the establishment of Israel because they feel that we've achieved the first step in this plan to bring Jesus back, okay? Okay, does that make sense? Okay? So, to summarize, the main message is this, okay? Here's what you need to know. First is that there are many Christians who believe that Israel and the Jews must be used as a tool to bring Jesus back, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is that America was founded as a Christian nation. Therefore, its soul is Christian. Its first leaders were Christians who believed in Christian Zionism. Their descendants now control the military and the foreign policy apparatus of America. Okay, that's the second thing, okay? And the third thing is that Israel, as a nation, thinks that it can use Christian Zionism in order to advance its geopolitical interests, which is to basically gain control over the Middle East. Okay, do you understand? And that's what's driving the conflict between Israel and Iran. Does that make sense? Okay? What's driving the conflict between Israel and Iran is America believes it has a religious responsibility to protect Israel against Iran. In fact, if there's a war between Iran and Israel, that's a good thing because it's going to drive this prophecy and the return of Jesus, okay? And then people in Israel are like, you know what? If we go to war with Iran, America is going to fight for us. So why not?
Yeah, that's pretty cheap.
Right? We don't have to fight this war. America's going to do it for us. So why not fight this war? We lose nothing. We gain everything from this war. Okay? So the idea is that all this is driven by a religious worldview, understanding the world. Okay? And over time, this worldview will only become more popular in America. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Okay, good. Any questions about this? Anything that's not clear about what I just what I just explained? Do you mean to clarify anything?
So why like Jewish they don't like believe like they put their nationality first instead of like believe the religion?
Okay. I don't really understand the question. Can you repeat the question?
I mean, like you said, like the Jewish, like they don't put like their race or their religion above their nationality. So why? But I think the Christians they believe in the religion more.
Right. So okay. So both Judaism and Christianity are religions. Okay. There's no race. There's no race to the idea of Christianity, right? You can be Chinese and Christian. You can be American and Christian. It doesn't matter, right? And that's what the Jewish people say as well. I can be Chinese and Jewish. I can be American and Jewish because being Jewish is a religion. But the idea of Zionism is that being Jewish person is a race. In fact, you are directly descended from the Hebrews in the Bible, which is complete nonsense. This is not true, okay?
Is this like is this idea still not popular or is it becoming more popular?
So Zionism is the main political belief of Israel, right? Why does Israel exist? Because Israel is the promised land that God gave to his chosen people. Okay? And this was a promise that dates back at least 3,000 years to the time of Abraham. And it's written in the Bible. Therefore, it must be true. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions? Okay, that's a great question, okay? All right. So I'm making the argument that Christian Zionism and dispensationalist premillennialism will over time become more popular religions in America. Okay, and the question, and Charles asks, like, well, why? Okay, let's go back to the founding of Christianity. Why did Christianity become so popular? It became popular because it was in the Roman Empire, okay? At that time, there's something called the Pax Romana, which meant the Roman peace. Okay? Which meant that the Romans controlled everything, therefore there were no wars, therefore people were at peace, right? And you think that's a good thing, right? The problem is that if there's peace, then you have massive inequality. Okay? Because war is a mechanism back then of social mobility. Right? War killed people. And if war kills people, that creates opportunities for the people who are alive. But if there's no war, then what happens is, if I'm a rich person, guess what, guys? I become more rich. If you're poor, what happens? You become more poor. Okay? So as a poor person, what do you think? You think that life is hopeless. Life is pointless. There's no future. There's no hope, right? And so Jesus comes along and says, listen, if you believe in me, then I will bring the kingdom of heaven onto earth, and I will destroy inequality. Everyone will be the same, okay? So again, back then it was a free lottery ticket. Today, we live in something called the Pax Americana. And the Pax Americana, same thing where for the past 70 years, there's been peace around the world, right? Very few people have died. But all that means really is that inequality has increased. Fewer and fewer people have money, okay? Guys, billionaires make no sense. Do you understand? Why should a few people have all the money? That makes no sense. Because money is meant as a mechanism of exchange and transaction, right? You use money, you should spend your money. If it's all in the bank, what's the point of that? Okay? So having billionaires is a bad thing. And if you go to America, you'll find that there are many young people who feel that like life is pointless. Okay? So they're looking for alternatives. You understand? And this idea of dispensationalist premillennialism, which is like what's happening right now in Israel will lead to a better world, that's kind of attractive to you. You understand? Right?
To these people who think life is meaningless. Why do they feel life is meaningless?
Well, because you're poor and you're stuck being poor. Guys, imagine you are a delivery person in China, in Beijing, okay? You're like a Kuai Yuan, right? What hope do you have for the future? Your life is pointless and hopeless. No one's going to marry you. Even if someone marries you, you can't have children because you can't afford to have your children go to school. You can't buy a house. You can't afford anything. You're stuck being a delivery person for the rest of your life. Do you understand? Do you know how many delivery people there are in China? Millions and millions. Okay, so you have millions and millions of young men who have no hope in the future. Right? Yes, because Jesus is coming and he's going to destroy the world we live in.
We're all going to live in harmony. I don't have to deliver food. So it's also a free lottery ticket.
That's exactly right. Christianity is a free lottery ticket. It costs you nothing. And if you win big. Okay?
Hey, that sounds kind of tempting. That actually sounds kind of tempting.
Right? What does it cost you? It costs you nothing, right? Okay? Do you understand? That's why it will become more popular over time.
But it will drive you to do something.
Excuse me?
Like, if you become more and more believe in this idea, you might want to have to do something for that.
Right. So what you do is you support America, you support Israel, you support the war against Iran. You want more conflict in the Middle East because the conflict in the Middle East will drive the prophecy, right? Do you understand? That's what you want. You want more war.
That's against the idea of peace.
What good does peace do you? Right? Peace just means like tomorrow you'll still be poor and hopeless. Right? But war, it's an opportunity for a new world. Exactly, right? So all this inequality is making people much more extreme and desperate, right? Which will lead more people to believe in dispensationalist premillennialism. Okay.
But does the government want this instability?
The government, of course, does not want any instability, but what can the government do about it?
I don't know, like they provide like social welfare to poor people.
You're absolutely right. Okay, so the government could provide social welfare to poor people, but where would the money come from?
The rich, the tax.
Right. You understand? Okay.
Fine.
Okay. Who's more dangerous to you? A few rich people or millions of poor people?
Poor people.
No.
But they're a lot.
No. A few rich people are much more dangerous than millions of poor people. Do you understand?
But if millions of poor people united, they can.
That's right. United, right? Poor people don't know how to unite.
So this is a opportunity for them to unite.
That's right.
Oh. Okay.
That's logical.
Yeah, that sounds fair.
Okay.
So this gives them a reason to fight those rich people.
Yeah, but
But they don't actually fight the rich people. They fight for something that's pretty much away from them. It's like a thing that might never come true.
right. Okay. Okay. So does this make sense? Okay. All right. So this is the so I mean it's hard because this is religion. Okay, and we're not religious. I'm not religious. You're not religious. So we don't really understand how religious people think. Okay. But remember that on this planet Earth, most people are religious, and they take their religion very, very seriously. Okay. Do you understand? They're willing to die for the religion. because they think that if I die from a religion, I'll go to heaven.
Why heaven so attractive?
Excuse me?
I mean, why heaven is so attractive?
Okay. All right. So
More attractive compared to their current life.
that's exactly right. Do you understand? Okay. All right. Because you're not giving people any hope, and religion gives people hope.
Next question. Isn't those poor people doing this to support the war between American, Israel, and Iran as a way for the rich people to use it to make them more reasonable in the attack, and they can draw money from it. So it's like those rich people are using those poor people's belief to support their war.
Listen, in the real world, the poor will always lose, the rich will always win, no matter what happens.
But the poor doesn't realize this yet.
That's right. That's why they're poor.
Okay.
Okay. So in this class, this semester, I'm making 3 big predictions, right? First is that Trump will win in November. Second is that the United States will go to war against Iran. And the third big prediction is that the United States will lose this war, which will forever change the global order. These past So last class, we looked at one reason why the United States would invade Iran, which is the Israel lobby. And in today's class, we'll look at another reason, which is the defense of empire. America is an empire, and it must defend its imperial status. So let's examine what an empire means for America. So from 1950 to 1980, America's economy was mainly focused on manufacturing, factories, okay? So manufacturing as a share of GDP was 40%. It made 40% of profits, okay? And it employed 30% of the workforce. So during World War II, America had a lot of factories to produce weapons. And after World War II, these factories produced consumer goods, cars, electronics, to sell to the world. And this made the American workers the wealthiest and most well-educated middle class ever in human history. If you were a factory worker from 1950 to 1980, you had a really good life. You worked 40 hours a week. You had health insurance. You could buy your own house. Your wife didn't have to work. You could have 3 to 4 kids. You could have 2 cars. Every year, you could go on vacation to some place nice. You could eat out once a week. And then you retired and had a very good pension. So it was really the best life. And so workers from 1950 to 1980 in America were really the luckiest people on the planet. You were better off actually being born into the middle class in America than you were being born rich in Africa or Asia or South America, okay? But then after 1980, was something called the Reagan Revolution and the introduction of what we call neoliberalism. And remember that we studied neoliberalism before. Neoliberalism is an economic philosophy that believes in the primacy of free markets and deregulation. So after that, we now live in today what we call a financial economy. Okay? The economy has been financialized. And so what does that mean? It means that right now, financial services okay, account for 22% of all GDP in America. Manufacturing has gone down to 10%. So it went down from a high of 40% to now a low of 10%. Financial services is now twice as much as manufacturing. Financial services bring in 40% of all profits. And financial services employs 5% of the total American workforce. Okay? Now, let me explain what these numbers mean. What you're seeing behind these numbers is a radical shift, overhaul, transition in American society. Okay? Let's just look at politics. Politics, governance. From this period, 1950, 1980, American workers had a lot of political power, right? Because they were middle class, they were confident, they participated in politics for unions, okay? Today, most of this power has shifted to the financial services, which basically means Wall Street. And working for Wall Street are what we called the professional managerial elite. Okay, so these are people who live on the coast, San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., Boston. They went to elite schools, okay, the Ivy League, and they're multicultural, and right now they're the most powerful political group in America. And this has led to massive political divisions within the country, okay? So it's the first major consequence. Before, it was workers who had a large say over American politics. And now it is Wall Street, the financial sector, and the coastal professional management elite. And so government shapes policies that favors this multicultural elite, financial elite, at the expense of workers, okay? So that's the first major shift. But then you look at education. And so what I mean by that is that, if you went to a good school, a good university in the 1950s and 1960s, your ambition was to become a professor, right? Or maybe a scientist, or maybe an entrepreneur, or a corporate executive, okay? Nowadays, most people who graduate from these top schools all want to go where? Wall Street, and that's it, okay? Why? Because you make more money on Wall Street than anywhere else. Okay? So you're talking about these PhDs in statistics and artificial intelligence who should be working for IBM, developing the latest technology, right? Instead, they're on Wall Street working for a hedge fund, gambling with other people's money. Okay, so basically the economy has gone from one that is productive or creative to one that is entirely speculative. Okay? So remember that the financial services, all it does is take people's money and gamble with it or invest in it to make more money. Okay? It's not actually productive. All it is speculative. Okay? And the smartest people in America, the most well-educated, are all focused on this sector. Okay? And then you look at the economy. And what has clearly changed is that the economy in America has become much more unstable. So in 2001, there was the internet crash, right? The dot-com crash. In 2008, there was the financial crisis, right? The subprime crash. And then after that, you have these banks going bankrupt, okay? I think like this past week, 3 banks went bankrupt in America. This should not be happening. And the reason why this is happening are all these bubbles, okay? So in other words, all assets right now in America are overpriced, okay? Housing, stock market, and people are gambling that these asset prices will only go higher, which creates bubbles. And when these bubbles burst, you have volatility and instability and uncertainty. Okay? So this is bad for the economy. And then you have things like inequality, right? So if you look at profits, if you look at wealth generation, the top 1% make much more money than everyone else. And this inequality is only increasing. Okay? So in other words, the financialization of the American economy has been really bad for America. And you can make the argument that it's actually destroying the fabric of American society. Okay? It's making politics much more divisive. It's making the economy much more volatile. The smartest people are engaged in speculative activities. Young people don't want to work. They just want to buy Bitcoin. And you can also make the argument that you're creating a rentier economy. Okay? And the rentier economy just means that if you are young, you can never afford to buy a house. You can only rent, which means that you yourself can never go from, you have no more social mobility. Okay? So this overall is really bad for America. Now the question then is, how did America get to this point? How did it transition from a manufacturing economy to a financial economy? And there are different theories out there, okay? There are some economists who say that this is just late-stage capitalism, okay? This is the natural evolution of capitalism. There are some who argue that it is the neoliberalism or the Reagan Revolution that caused this. Okay, when you cut back the role of government, when you emphasize free markets, then you have this situation, the over-financialization of the economy, okay? What I want to show you today is that the real reason is the transition to empire, okay? There's a really simple explanation for why this is happening, and the reason is that after the end of the Cold War, 1991, America became a global empire. It could now set the rules of the game, and it set the rules of the game so that it would always win. And then all money flowed to America, which created all these asset bubbles. Okay? So that's the argument I'm making to you today, okay? So are we clear about what's happening? Any questions so far? Okay, now I want to explain to you how America became an empire. In fact, the most powerful empire in human history, because even though Rome was powerful, it didn't really control the world. Whereas America, the American empire today, controls the entire world. Okay? And so, to understand how America became an empire, you have to go back to the founding of America. Okay? So in 1776, America declared independence from Britain. And at that time, they had something called the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, if you read the document, it's very clear. It's what the founding fathers of America said is that we are founding a new society in America based on God. Okay? Now, the founding fathers were Christians, but they were a special type of Christians who believed in the idea of deism. And deism is the idea that, yes, there is a God, and God did create everything, but God is not interested in managing human affairs. God leaves us alone, which means that we as humans are empowered to create the world we want to create. Okay? And the founding fathers wanted to create a new society based on the idea of God, okay? And what they believed is that God gave human beings 3 fundamental rights that all governments must respect, okay? And so the famous phrase is, Do you guys know the famous phrase? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? That is the mission, the purpose of America, to ensure that every American would have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's really the goal, the role of government. Life, to make you safe, okay? To provide security against enemies. Liberty, the right to say whatever you believe, the right to believe whatever you believe, okay? So the tolerance of all creeds, religions. Now last is the pursuit of happiness. What does pursuit of happiness mean? You guys know? So Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and when he wrote the pursuit of happiness, he had a very specific idea in mind. What does the pursuit of happiness mean? Which is what? Okay, so wealth, okay? So in America, your fundamental right, the fundamental purpose of your life is to make as much money as you can, to amass as much wealth as you can, okay? And the idea here is that in this society, in this new society, this new experiment called America, if we allow everyone to pursue the creation of wealth, then America will become powerful. Okay? That's the idea. And it turned out that this idea was absolutely correct. Okay? In a very short amount of time, America industrialized very rapidly. And at the end of World War II, America became the most powerful country in the world. Okay? After World War II, it decided that it can now export its philosophy to the rest of the world. So in 1944, there's something called the Bretton Woods Conference. Okay? And so in 1944, everyone knew that Nazi Germany would be defeated, okay, and Japan would be defeated, which would make America the most powerful, the richest nation on the planet, okay? Now, the Soviet Union was a competitor, but they didn't really matter, okay? They had their own sphere of influence. So America got together with its allies in Europe, and they decided what the new global financial system would look like. And the idea was that with Bretton Woods, they decided that the US dollar would become the global reserve currency, which basically meant that you could buy anything with the US dollar. Now, there are some people at Bretton Woods, some economists, who were afraid that this would cause problems, right? If you have a government which was in control of the global reserve currency, that would basically make the government God, right? If they could just print as much money as they wanted, they could become like Midas. If they touch something, it would become gold, okay? So some people thought it was dangerous. And so the compromise is that the US dollar had to be backed by gold, okay, the gold standard. In other words, the US dollar was basically like a receipt for gold. If you had $1 million, okay, you could go to any American bank and get $1 million worth of gold for it. Okay, does that make sense? So that's what we call the gold standard. And for the longest, and so that led, this Bretton Woods system led to tremendous prosperity in America and in Europe and in Japan, okay? Then, in 1971, Richard Nixon did something really radical. He basically said, we America, we're gonna go off the gold standard, okay? Remember that America had spent too much money on the space race, on Vietnam, on domestic expenses, okay? So they needed to transition out of the gold standard. But if you transition out of the gold standard, then how do you ensure the US dollar is worth something? How do you ensure the intricate worth of the US dollar? So they transitioned from the gold standard to what? Do you guys know? Oil, okay, do you understand? And that's what we call the petrodollar. And the idea here is that, look, every economy needs oil to run, right? You need oil as the basis of your economy. And so after America went off the gold standard, these countries in the Middle East, mainly Saudi Arabia, but other countries as well, agreed that you could buy oil using US dollars. So the idea is, okay, before, if you had $1 million, $1 million US dollars, you could convert that to gold, okay? And now you can convert it to oil. And this is what we call the petrodollar. And this is really the basis for the value of the US dollar today, okay? So then what happened is that in 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and now America was in charge of the entire global economy, basically, okay? And so America at that time said to everyone, listen, let's focus on trade, because trade will make everyone rich. Okay, so let me explain the theory of this, okay? So America basically wanted everyone to trade. And the idea of trade, okay, this is like Russia, China, okay, South America. And the idea of trade is that each country would focus on its competitive advantage. What are you good at? And then you would sell this competitive advantage to other countries for what they're good at, okay? And the theory here is that if you do it this way, then all countries will become rich. Okay? So let me explain why. All right, so let's look at US and China, okay? So what China's really good at is cheap labor. The United States, what the United States is really good at is technology, right? Okay, so the idea is that the United States and China trade, right? So China makes all these cheap goods for American consumers. But unfortunately, Chinese consumers don't have enough purchasing power to buy American technology, right? Okay? So what happens is that America gives China US dollars instead, okay? Trillions and trillions of US dollars. Now, in theory, what's supposed to happen is this money trickles down to the average Chinese so that the average Chinese worker, his wages go up, right? And when his wages go up, what he can do now is buy US products like iPhones. And so over time, trade evens out, okay? Does that make sense? That's a theory, okay? That's the first theory. The second theory is how capital moves, okay? And the idea here is that capital is going to go to places which allows it to grow the most, okay? And so the idea is that when you have a globalized world, then what happens is capital from the United States moves to China, right? Because if you invest in China, your capital grows the most. You can buy $1 million house in the United States, or you can buy 10 houses for the same money in China. So you're better off buying houses in China, right? Okay. So these are the two theories. One is that trade will make everyone rich. And second is that capital will move from rich countries to poor countries, okay? And when you actually go to university and you study economics, like Jack will, then you actually have to learn these theories. But in reality, these two theories aren't true, okay? Why not? Why are these two theories true? So the first theory is that if two countries trade, over time, wealth trickles down to everyone in that country, which makes everyone richer. Okay? Is that true for China? No, it's not, okay? Workers' wages have not gone up for the past 30, 40 years. Why? Because of the idea of elite capture. Elite capture. So all the money is captured by an elite group of people. But when that happens, okay, they can't spend it. They can't buy US goods, right? So the only thing they can do is invest it, right? Now, according to this theory, they should invest it back in China because investment in China should allow for more growth than investment anywhere else, okay? But in reality, where do they put their money? In the United States. And why would they do that? Why? Exactly, okay? You don't put your money where you make the most money. You put your money where it's the most safe, okay? That's why we have banks. So because the United States controls the US dollar, and because people's wealth is expressed in US dollars, it makes the most sense to put your money in the United States, okay? And this is not just true for China, it's true for most countries in the world. And that's why, starting in the 90s, you have all this wealth amassing in the United States, okay? Does that make sense? So everything in the United States became overpriced. Everything became a speculative bubble. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's look at equities, okay? Stock market. Stocks. In the year 1900, okay? In the year 1900, if you look at all the world's stock markets, the largest was the UK, okay? Because obviously the UK is the most powerful country in the world, was the most powerful country at that time. At that time, the UK was the most powerful country. Okay, so in its stock market, as a percentage of the entire global stock market, was about 25%, okay? 24 to 25%. The United States was second at 14.5%. Then you had Germany, about 13%, France at 11%, okay? So that was the situation of wealth in the year 1900. And this makes sense, right? These four countries are industrially extremely powerful. Today, okay, the year 2024, the United States has 60% of all the world's stock wealth. Okay? Who's second? Can you guys guess? Who would be second? Japan, okay? And what is the percentage of global stock wealth? Can you guys guess a number? The United States has 66%, 60%. How much does Japan have? Can you guess a number? 10% is a good guess, right? It's actually 6%. Okay? Do you see the disparity? Number one is 60%. Japan, number two, is 6%. It's huge disparity. How much is China? The world's second largest economy. 3%, okay? Do you understand? Right? So all this wealth that's being generated around the world, it can only end up one place. Okay? The United States. All right? So you have, and that's what's pushed the financialization of the US economy. Okay? Because this wealth goes to the United States, and someone has to manage this wealth. And this is the financial services sector, okay? So people on Wall Street, and this is very important, people on Wall Street, they make their money based on how they manage this wealth, not on whether or not they make money out of this money. Do you understand? They charge a management fee, okay? So in other words, they're not actually incentivized to be conservative and make sure that this money grows. What they're incentivized to do is design riskier and riskier assets and investment opportunities to attract more investment, because then they can take a management fee, a cut. Okay, does that make sense? And that's what's led to so much financial overspeculation over the past 20 years in America. And one of America's biggest problems is the growing national debt, okay? So the government is paying for a lot of government services just by putting money, okay? So right now, the US national debt is about $34 trillion, okay? And this $34 trillion debt, half of it is owned by foreigners, okay? So Japan has about $1 trillion, China has about 800 billion, so they buy US treasuries, okay? So America owes Japan $1 trillion, America owes China $800 billion. And then half of it, the government owes to its people. So the two largest expenses are the military and the pension system, okay? So $34 trillion is a lot of money because the US GDP is about $100 trillion. So the total debt is about a third of America's GDP. And this debt has interest, right? So this debt is growing about 1 to 2 trillion every 2 to 3 months, okay? And all this is saying, okay, these numbers, all they're telling us is there's absolutely no way that America can pay all this debt, okay? So then the question then is, if you're China and you're Japan, why do you have all this debt knowing that America can never pay you back? Or America will at some point default on this debt. Why? Why does Japan and China and other countries have all this debt, US treasuries, knowing that America can never really pay back all this debt? Why? Okay, so there are many reasons, okay? The first reason is that, in theory, Japan and China can always take this debt and buy oil with it, okay? So this is, again, the petrodollar. Second reason is that even though America is in debt, it's still an empire. It's still the greatest military power in the world. So at some point, you feel that the money is safe there, okay? Does that make sense? Because no one can actually challenge America militarily. And the third reason, and this is the most important reason, is there's no place for you to go. You understand? What else? Where else can you put your money? Nowhere, okay? So that's the issue right now. And so in theory, because China and Japan can buy oil with it, and because there's really no place for China and Japan to put this money, in theory, this system can go on forever, okay? So it's possible that maybe in 10 years' time, the debt will be 340 trillion, okay? Who knows, okay? So in theory, this could go on forever, right? Because America's an empire. But then, what happened 2-3 years ago is Russia invaded Ukraine, okay? Russia invaded Ukraine. And why this is important is that this is basically Russia challenging the dominance of the American empire, okay? What Putin is really saying to the United States is, I think your empire is full of lies. Your empire is based on nothing. Your empire is based on the perception that you are invincible in war. Well, I'm going to invade Ukraine and prove everyone wrong, okay? I'm going to show that you, America, are in fact a paper tiger. Okay? And so, if Putin succeeds in his war in Ukraine, then the fundamental understanding of how the world works, that America is an empire, that America is invincible, that the US dollar is safe, will radically change. Okay? It will be destroyed, it will be undermined, it will be subverted. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's why America needs to stop Russia in Ukraine. Okay? Can it stop Russia? Can it stop Russia in Ukraine? How's the war going for America in Ukraine? Pretty badly, okay? I mean, the war's almost over. Okay, so But what America can do, okay, which will solve all these problems, is for America to transition from a financial economy back to a manufacturing economy. Okay? If America just does this, America has nothing to worry about. It doesn't have to worry about the debt. It doesn't have to worry about Russia. It doesn't really have to worry about the world, okay? Because America is a self-sufficient economy, meaning that it has the resources to sustain itself. It doesn't really need to trade with the rest of the world, okay? If America can return to being a manufacturing economy, then it will be invincible, okay? Now the question then is, can America reindustrialize? Yes or no? Why not, Jack?
Because their politics doesn't allow them to.
Because the politics doesn't allow them to, exactly. But can you explain that?
Like the financial sector has too much political power, so all they're trying to do is to perpetuate financialization.
Yeah.
They won't allow America.
That's exactly right, Jack, okay? So, yes, the problem right now is the very structure of American society and politics and the economy. Right now, the financial sector has all the power. And they don't want to go back to the time when manufacturing had all the power, right? So that's the first problem. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they agree to this, okay? What's your other problem if you want to reindustrialize? Excuse me? Okay, but all the foreign investment can just go into factories, right? But there's actually a really big problem with reindustrialization, okay? So as Jack says, there will be political resistance to this, okay? But then you have a bigger problem than this, which is what? Okay, guys, the problem with this economy is it creates a speculative mindset, okay? So therefore, no one wants to work hard. No one wants to go to work in factories anymore. Do you understand? If you're a young person, you would much rather spend your time investing in Bitcoin than working in a factory. Do you understand? Because investing in Bitcoin gives you the opportunity to become rich. But if you work in a factory, you have to work hard for 40 years just to buy a house. Okay, does that make sense? So you're not going to find people to work these factories. That's a bigger problem, okay? And the third problem, of course, is just investment. How do you build these factories? You not only have to build these factories, but you also have to build logistics networks to move goods from one place to the next, okay? Okay? So, in other words, America could reindustrialize, but it's a pain in the ass, right? You're going to face a lot of political opposition, especially from the financial sector. It's very hard for you to get people to work in factories. And plus, where's all this money going to come from, okay? So, if you can't beat Russia in Ukraine, and if you can't reindustrialize, then what can you do to protect the petrodollar and your financial system? Well, I have an idea, okay? Invade Iran, okay? Invade Iran. Now, why would you do that? And the answer is that, unfortunately, of all the options out there, okay, because America can't just sit back and let its empire collapse, right? Of all the options out there, invading Iran happens to be politically the easiest to do, okay? You can't go fight a war against Russia because Russia has nuclear weapons. You cannot reindustrialize because there'll be too much political opposition towards that. Plus, it'll take you about 50 years to reindustrialize. But if you invade Iran, well, you accomplish three things, okay? The first thing is you show the world that you're still the top dog. Your military is still invincible, okay? So if you're a foreign investor in America, you have $1 trillion US dollars, you feel safe, okay? You don't think the US dollar will collapse. Okay? That's the first thing. To show the world that America is still the world's foremost military power, therefore the US dollar is safe. Okay? Second is oil, right? What is the US dollar based on? Oil, right? Well, if you control oil, then you don't have to worry about people abandoning the US dollar. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and it happens that the Middle East produces 40% of the world's oil. And Iran is the world's fourth largest oil exporter. But when you take over Iran, you also control Iraq as well. You control that entire area, okay? And the third thing about invading Iran is trade, okay? So that area, most of the world's trade has to pass through that area, right? So invading Iran would allow you to control the world's shipping lanes, okay? So that would be the theory behind invading Iran, okay? But the motivation would be to save the American empire. Because if Putin wins in Ukraine, then America is going to look weak. It's going to look like a paper tiger, okay? And in this situation, as the empire, you have to act. Today, you have a lot of countries in Africa who are rebelling against the Western powers, France, basically, and America. Why? Because they think that Putin is now in charge, okay? Why did October 7th, why did Hamas attack Israel? I guarantee you that if it were not for the war in Ukraine, Hamas would not have done such a thing, okay? For the longest time before the war in Ukraine, there was a perception in the world that America was militarily invincible. No power, no country could ever dare stand up against the United States. And by invading Ukraine, Putin has proved everyone wrong, okay? That the United States can be defeated. And so what the United States must do now is prove to the world, nope, we're still militarily the greatest power in the world. Okay, does that make sense? Okay? And again, it must do so to protect its financial economy. Otherwise, there's a very good chance that this financial economy will implode onto itself. Okay? If China, Japan, other countries pull out of the U.S. financial sector, okay? If they sell their U.S. treasuries, not only will America face a sovereign debt crisis, but it will lose access to easy money, okay? Easy money. And the problem in America today is that America is an empire addicted to easy money, okay? People are so used to just sitting around and making millions of dollars that they cannot imagine or tolerate a day when they would have to go back to working hard, okay? So it's this addiction to easy money which will drive America to invade Iran. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, any questions?
If all the money goes to America, how do they manage it since maybe they're like the end of all the money?
Okay, so all this money coming to America, how is it managed? Okay, so this is actually very complicated, okay? Because again, the financial sector is very large. But if you have US dollars, then your options are you can invest in the stock market, you can invest in houses, okay? The problem today is because there are too many rich people in the world, and all this money is going to America, all assets are bubbles now, okay? So the irony of all this is that you feel that your only option is to invest in America, but when you do this, you're actually losing value. Okay? And that's why the system is not really sustainable. Everyone's going to America, and that's driving up all these asset prices, but in the long term, that will destroy the American economy. In the long term, it'll create all these bubbles that will also destroy individual wealth. Okay, does that make sense? Any more questions?
So, like, if America loses the war in Iran, like, then, like, other countries will lose even more confidence in America, so their system will, like, completely fall apart.
Okay, so Jack asked a great question, which is like, listen, if going to Iran is all about restoring confidence in the United States, well, if America loses the war, then that would destroy even more confidence, okay? And so this is the problem of empires. Empires have something called hubris, right? Imperial hubris, which means that they cannot imagine the possibility of losing a war, okay? So why is that? Okay, there are two reasons, okay? There are two reasons. The first reason is that what an empire is, it's a force that imposes reality onto others, okay? An empire makes you see the world the way the empire wants you to see the world. Okay, does that make sense? Which means there's no feedback loop, which means that you cannot actually tell the empire what you think. Your voice doesn't matter. Which means that an empire, it's not possible for an empire to imagine the possibility of it ever collapsing. You understand? If it could, it would never collapse. Okay, that's the first problem. Second problem is that, okay, let's do a thought experiment. If you had a choice, would you rather be smart and strategic or stupid and arrogant? If you had a choice in an ideal world, would you rather be smart and strategic or stupid and arrogant? Okay, the answer is stupid and arrogant because it makes you feel good, okay? Stupid people feel good about themselves, right? Smart people get depressed. They doubt themselves. They question themselves, and that makes you feel bad. Most people in an ideal world would want to feel good about themselves always, okay? So when you are an empire, you want to be stupid and arrogant because it makes you feel good. Okay, does that make sense? Okay? But that's why empires collapse, because once they have too much power, they become stupid and arrogant. And they refuse to consider the possibility that they could be wrong. Okay? Does that make sense, Jack? Okay? Any more questions?
So did the empire start when they start to trade with the world or when the bubble started?
Okay, the American empire has been building for a long time. Okay, so you can make the argument that the empire really started after World War II, because now America controlled half the world. And then it became dominant after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And at that time, okay, before the collapse of the Cold War, America had to behave itself. And the reason it had to behave itself was it wasn't afraid of the Soviet Union, it was afraid of communism, right? That's why from 1950 to 1980, they treated their workers so well, because they were afraid of a worker revolt, right? So the real threat was not the Soviet Union, the real threat was communism as an opposing ideology to capitalism. Unfortunately today, there's no opposing ideology towards capitalism, okay? And that's why America can do what it wants. It does not fear any enemies, it does not fear internal revolt. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, all right, so I'll see you guys next week.